My next guest is a really incredible man. He's a critic, an author, an essayist, and a composer. He says he never gets any credit for being a composer, just for being a writer. And his books, Enderby and A Clockwork Orange, and he has a new one now called MF, M with a thing here, this is an F, Anthony Burgess' newest book, has just been published by Cavett. And will you welcome, please, an incredibly prolific man, Mr. Anthony Burgess. Yeah. How are you? How are you?
Oh, fine. If I said, where was I? Yeah, fine, fine, yes. Yes, a man of words, she was saying, is like a garden full of weeds. I'm sorry about that.
A man of words?
A man of words, yes, a man of words, yes. Sorry about that.
That's quite all right, sir. It's funny, you're sitting here, an Englishman who has come to America.
Yes.
And not long ago, S.J. Perelman was sitting there, an American who went to England. He said he couldn't work anymore, and he thought he could write better in England, and you've come to this country
yes,
for about the same reverse reason.
No, I've not come from England. I've come from Italy. I left England a couple of years ago. I think Perelman will probably find that he'll like London very much. I like London, but he won't be able to work there.
He won't?
Well, there's nothing to write about, you see. We reached a kind of stasis, you know. There are no interesting fights going on in London as there are here. We seem to have solved a lot of our racial problems. People don't starve in the streets. It's a kind of achieved society, and this is very fine, but you can't write anything about it. In a kind of utopian society, you don't need literature. So we come here where there's plenty going on, and there's plenty to write about. A bit too much of anything.
You like a bit of conflict to keep the juices going.
Oh, indeed, yes, indeed, yes. I'm sorry about that.
All right. Yeah. Well, you did a book on Shakespeare, which is really great.
Thank you very much.
Great fun to read, and I thought it would be dismal because I was Shakespeare was forced on me in high school. It was punishment. If you aren't careful, you'll have to read Shakespeare. You know, that sort of attitude. And but I finally got I overcame that. I think. Do they do that in England? Do they cram Macbeth down kids' throats?
Just the same, just the same. But I wrote this particular book because there's so many books on Shakespeare being written. You know, if it were a new book on, say, Woodrow Wilson, there's a fairly small number of those books, and any addition seems a bit unnecessary. But there's so many books on Shakespeare, there's always room for a new one. And I was not concerned. Yes. I was not concerned with writing about the plays, but trying to find out something about the man. It's astonishing to me that, you know, a man like that, a local boy, brought up in a small town with no real education, saddled with a wife and 3 kids, no job, his father out of work, many children in the house, should become genuinely, I think, generally, the greatest writer who's ever lived. How did it happen? What's the man like? And this is what I've been trying to find out.
And how could he do it without going to college? Is there that same snobism in Europe that there is that...
Well, it happened. It still goes on, but this has been going on for 400 years nearly now. People have been saying that Shakespeare couldn't have written the plays because he wasn't clever enough. Well, they bring up candidates like Sir Francis Bacon, who was a very learned man, knew Latin and Greek and so on, and the Earl of Oxford, and even Queen Elizabeth I, saying that she possibly wrote the plays in her spare time. And yet the whole point surely is that Shakespeare was such a showbiz man.
Showbiz? A
showbiz man, that he had this great gift of pretense. He could kid the audience, he could kid his auditors, that he knew things he didn't know. He could not be a psychiatrist, he could not be a clergyman, but he could bring these characters on the stage and make them convincing. And this is the great trick that Shakespeare had, that some of the humorless scholars who can't believe that he wrote them will not believe, will not accept. And I was trying to find out what this man was really like. The whole story began, I think, for me with a remark I heard in a village not far from Stratford, where Shakespeare was born, in a local pub. Now, you know, in England, time tends to stand a bit still. I lived in a village, for instance, where I was for many years quite happy and well known, and I left this village in the Midlands for 6 years. I went to Malaya. We had our own war going on then, there. And when I came back, I went to the local pub. After 6 years, the local mailman said, "Hello, Mr. Burgess, you just come back from your holidays?" Vacation. And so it was possible to hear stories about Shakespeare which seemed to indicate that they thought he was still alive. Just disappeared for a few weeks. But one story I heard, a very curious story, and this has been confirmed by other stories, was that Shakespeare carried on with a black woman. He left his wife in Stratford, he went to London, and London in those days was full of black women, and men too, but A lot of the brothels in East London were full of black women who were a kind of spécialité de la maison. And Shakespeare had an affair with one of these women, not a prostitute, but a courtesan,
yes.
a high-class black woman, much nicer. And it was alleged that from her he caught syphilis. And the reason why you have the man who was called Sweet Master Shakespeare, the man who wrote the sonnets and As You Like It and Twelfth Night and Midsummer Night's Dream, suddenly became the roaring man who wrote King Lear and Hamlet and the other plays, was because he got a dose of syphilis in between. And this affected the brain, producing general paralysis of the insane. And this explains this great genius. It's an interesting idea, and I've been trying to work on it.
And certainly a worthy job it is, too, to work on it. Well,
thank you very much.
Yes, I hope you get to the bottom of it. You've guided yourself.
Yeah. It's a slow job.
That is interesting. Well, I always think Shakespeare should be cast into a new light to keep him refreshing that way, and certainly nothing like that was ever said in my high school
There's just
class.
nothing. Oh, I know. Well, come to mind. There's just nothing there. We have to try and build up this character out of practically nothing, and it's a pity one has to start with odd things like diseases and unpaid bills and leaving his wife and having his first child 6 months after the marriage. But this is the only kind of material we have to build on. Clergymen don't like it. They like to regard Shakespeare as a great moral influence. But I'm afraid the facts belie that view of him totally.
Speaking of diseases,
yes,
when probably the story you're the tiredest of telling is the one I would like to ask you to tell when we come back from this message. When we come back, if you're still here, I'll ask you to tell. Well, it does. We were talking about who wrote Shakespeare's plays, and it's never, I guess, going to be completely solved. I always feel that
Shakespeare wrote them.
It was Shakespeare.
Or a man of the same name.
Yes, or someone just as good,
That's
or
right,
something.
Yes. It's got the same name.
Here's the thing I was thinking about, and you probably are tired of this, but you had a terrifying experience one time,
yes,
and maybe several, but the one I'm thinking of,
yes,
and it resulted in 5 books. And if you can drag yourself through telling it again, you must, on television, there meet a lot of new people who haven't heard.
Well, I'll tell you very quickly. This is how one becomes a professional writer.
Yes, that's how I should
Yes,
the question.
really, this is it. By professional, I mean earning one's living from writing. I'd been in Malaya, Far East, and I'd been working there during the trouble we had with the communists. And one day I'd been writing books, a kind of gentlemanly hobby. While the fan was whizzing and other people were asleep, I was drinking my gin pints and whiskey stingers and turning out the books. And one day I collapsed, I fell down. And I think it was boredom more than anything, but they took me home, they sent me home, and they said they made me submit to all sorts of tests, tapping spinal fluid and shoving air into the skull and taking photographs by putting dye into the carotid arteries. And a conclave of doctors came around my bed and they said, something in your head, I said, yes, that's talent. And they said, no, it's something much more malignant. We think you've got a cerebral tumor. We can't get at it because there's a kind of film of tissue masking it. So all we can do is discharge you from the hospital and give you 1 year to live. Well, I was not really dismayed at this at all because I knew I had a year to live. I mean, tonight, leaving the studio, I may be knocked down or mugged or knifed or something. But I knew then that I had a year to live, and there's not one member of this audience who has that same assurance that I had then. But the question was, what does one do with this final year? I mean, you can make a kind of short list of people you're going to take with you. And, they're very rarely public figures, usually people one knew in the army, like physical training corporals and the like. But I did this, and then I had the problem of living. I had no money, and I also had a prospective widow. So the only thing to do was to write. I had nothing to do but write. That's the only thing I could do. I couldn't take a job. I couldn't say, look, I've only got a year to live. Would you give me a job? They'd say there's no future in it. So I wrote. I wrote 5 novels in this terminal year. And I wrote a couple of plays and articles and poems and so forth. And I found it could be done. I found that if one approached the job, not as many people approach it, with reference to inspiration and the muse, and I can't write when I'm tired, and I can't write when I'm drunk, and I can't write when I'm sexually inclined and so forth. One got down to the job of writing as a carpenter gets down to the job of making a table or a chair. So it was possible to turn out something like 5 novels in a year and other books as well. Nobody liked this, of course. People accused me of over-fecundity. And they used to say, you know, Burgess, have you written your monthly novel yet? Yeah. Which was not quite the right image, I felt, at the time.
To accuse a dying man of showing off is not
no,
the best
I agree.
taste.
But anyway, I got over this business, and I'm still alive, and I became a professional writer.
And nothing happened?
Nothing happened. I still think it was a put-up job. I think it was political rather than clinical. But that, again, is a long story. My first wife said something rude to the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen's consort, who was visiting Malaysia at the time, and I think they were just looking for an opportunity to throw me out.
What was the rude thing she said, or could you tell us?
I don't know whether I can say it on this program. The Duke of Edinburgh was asking various people, you know, what they thought of the place. It was Borneo, actually. Borneo, I remember it very well. And people said, it's very nice, thank you, Your Royal Highness, and everything is perfect. And my wife said, who's Welsh? She said, no, it is not bloody well all right, or what's that effect. Things are bloody awful. And the Duke of Edinburgh was, you know, interested, but the conversation got no further than that. Yet there were black looks from the British resident and the other officials. Never say the British are inefficient. They are not. They had me out of that damn place with this suspected tumour on the brain in, I think, something like a fortnight. They were just waiting for me to exhibit signs of something, even boredom or frustration, and then they grabbed it. And out I went.
Got you out. But what a terrifying thing to do to a person. Since then, do you have a jollier attitude toward death since you've survived it in a...
Well, no, I have no right to be alive, of course, because of that. But I'm also working out a kind of philosophy of it. Nobody really has a right to be alive. Everybody has a right to be born. But nobody has a right to live. You see, because once you start saying, I have a right to live, then comes along the question, well, how long? And you can't say. So I'm 54, and Shakespeare died at 52. I have no right to live 2 years longer than Shakespeare. Dylan Thomas was dead at 39. Chatterton was dead at 18, and Keats was dead at 25, 26. We have no right to live in that sense, but we have a right to be born. And on this basis, you can build up a very interesting philosophy about abortion. I don't know why I looked at you, but...
You had to look at someone.
Yes,
I'm the only one.
Couldn't have looked at me, no, of course not. You like pubs, I know,
I
and
like
this
pubs,
is something I cannot get with, the idea. It seems to be a writer's thing to like to go and sit in a bar, and to me that's the most boring thing in the world, to sit in a bar, and yet I would love to be a writer. If I go and sit in one, is it likely to make me one?
Well, a bar is not a pub. I think this is the answer.
Oh, you mean a pub, not a bar.
A bar is not a pub. There are one or two pubs, I think, in New York. Third Avenue has something like pubs. But a real pub is a place where all the social barriers come down. You can drink with a member of the aristocracy or the local dustman. You play darts, you drink, you talk, and by this means you generate, you know, an atmosphere of genuine democratic society. And you get ideas, you hear stories, you talk. And this is useful for a writer. The only pubs you must not, if you're a writer, go to are the pubs in Dublin. Because in Dublin, you talk your book. You say, I'm writing a darling book. Tell us about it, they say. Then you tell them about it. And by the time you finish telling them about it, you've spent the desire to write it.
You've given birth to your book.
Exactly. The book is finished. You close it.
Can you teach writing? That's presumably what you're doing at Princeton, isn't it?
Well, if there are any Princetonians listening or watching, I'd better say, yes, you can do it.
But if they weren't watching...
If they weren't watching, I'd say you can't do it. I'd say that you can teach people how to put a scene together. You can teach people how to write verse. But you can't teach them how to have original ideas or to have a knowledge of life. And unfortunately, in universities, the kids who want to write are usually very young, and their desire to write is really a symptom of pubescence. You know, children, undergraduates, sophomores, bring along little poems. Well, these poems obviously had to be written because they're about love. They've fallen in love with somebody. They've had their first sexual experience, and this to them is wonderful. So they have to get it down on paper. But the result is not necessarily art. And all we can say is very pretty. You know, carry on living, but don't regard this as literature.
So a man who hasn't had a good a feeling of something like a good feeling of emotion or something like that might write a better poem than a man who has had the feeling
I think you've got to write. You've got to have a love of words. I think this is the beginning. And you know, some of the most moving poems, ones ever read, were not written from the heart. They were written from the brain. John Milton wrote this poem, Lycidas, about a friend of his who'd drowned crossing the Irish Sea, and this was one of the greatest elegiac poems ever written. But Milton didn't give a damn about this man. It was just presumed that, you know, because they knew each other fairly well, they were undergraduate friends, Milton, being a poet, ought to do something about it. But the poems written by the men who really felt for this man, who cried over his death, are just no good at all. They're not remembered. It's a terrible thing, but it's true. It's a hard-hearted profession. It's a cold-blooded profession.
Somewhere a high school teacher has just fainted from hearing that Milton was not a... Well, my wife has read every single word you have written. I don't mean almost every single word. I mean every single word. If there's a word that you have written that you've forgotten, she will know what it is. It's a strange thing, but MF, there's a great controversy going over what the MF stands for, and you haven't revealed it.
No, well, it means what... It means
male and female.
It means what you think it means.
You know, that's the only thing I hadn't thought of.
It isn't the hero who is that, it's his grandfather.
Oh, what a relief.